Lanma.
Ka whakarongo aki au ki te tangi a te manu nei a te mātui. Tui runga, tui raro, tui roto, tui waho. Tui ki te muka tangata i tākea mai i Hawaiki nui, Hawaiki roa, Hawaiki pāmāmao. Tui ki te hono wairoa ki a kiake au ka awatea, ti hei wā mauri ora, mai te whai ao ki te ao mārama. He mihi ki te atua, ko ia te matapuna o ngā mea katoa. Tēnei te mihi ki te hunga mati, rātau, kua whitirangitia, haere atu rā. Ka huri au ki te kanohi ora, i tēnei ahi, tēnei pō, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou katoa. Good evening. I should say a little bit about myself before I launch into my prepared text this evening. I'll start with my Paihia briefly. Ko Pukikoe te maunga, ko Waikato te awa, ko Bombay te waka, ko Ngāti Tiriti te iwi, ko Samuel David Carpenter tōku ingoa. So I grew up in the Pukikoe area, south of Auckland. I sort of identify as Ngāti Paihia or Ngāti Te Tiriti. That is those who are here by right of the treaty, in the words of Justice Eddie Jury, Secretary Jury. And what else? Just a brief snapshot of my story. Following, obviously, early years in Pukikoe, went to Auckland and went to law school at Auckland University and did a Bachelor of Arts as well, initially in philosophy. And got sick of philosophy because it was too airy-fairy and decided I'd get more grounded by doing history, Māori studies and te reo. So I did that. I was at university for far too long, 6 years initially, and I kind of haven't left in a sense since then. So then I practiced law for a few years, and then did some further study along the way in history, and completed an MA in New Zealand history. Then what happened? Then we went up to Hokianga. When I say up, it's not really, it's more that way. Or down, if you're thinking in Māori terms. So I went to Hokianga to develop the te reo by going to a little tech there at Te Rawani. And then moved back to Pukikoe and got some work for the tribunal, Waitangi Tribunal, actually while I was in Hokianga, for the Northland Inquiry. And then following that, I went to Wellington. We've been for about 3 years with my wife, and now 3 children. And I'm now working for the Office of Treaty Settlements, for Te Tari Whakatau Take I Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the office that settles claims pertaining to the Treaty of Waitangi, otherwise known as OTS. And I'm a senior historian there. I should say for clarity that I'm not the senior historian. There are a few senior historians. There are in fact quite a lot of historians, I think about 20 at last count. So that indicates the pace at which the government is attempting to work through treaty settlements. So that's a really interesting place to be. And I should give the usual disclaimer before I begin that obviously the talk I'm giving tonight is my own views and in no way reflects the views of the Office of Treaty Settlements. In any event, this is an historic lecture, so I'm not getting into the interesting question of Crown Treaty Settlement policy. So with that little intro, I will launch into this. And I should just say that in my mihi in Māori I was talking about, or at least the earlier bit, I was talking about the things that bind us in between past and present. This is a very loose translation. Past and present, the heavens and the earth, peoples from all over the world. In a sense, our places of origin, just basically talking about the things that bind us together. In this bicentenary year of the coming of the Christian gospel, the good news, or Te Rongo Pai, to these shores, it seems only proper to open my remarks tonight with the words of a Māori churchman as he reflected on the legacy of Christianity in this very place and throughout the country, and in particular on the legacy of the work of Karuwha Te Waramu, Henry Williams. The Reverend Matiu Taupaki of Te Raroa was ordained in 1861 and ministered from Paihia to the wider Bay of Islands area. I read some account that said he was from Te Arawa, but I'm pretty sure it's Te Raroa. There's obviously quite a major difference between those two. In 1876, he was the key mover in establishing the memorial to Henry Williams that stands outside this church building. The memorial was expressed to be from the Māori church, and some prominent area mentioned, including Ngāti Kahungunu, Ngāti Porou, and of course Ngāpui. In his address to the large hui of Māori and Pākehā that assembled to mark this unveiling, or the unveiling of this memorial, and there were some 800 people at this event, the Reverend Taupaki said this, and he did not hold back. Think of the wickedness of our island. The exceeding heavy stone which weighed us down was cannibalism, but that did not deter him, speaking of Williams. He forsook his own country and people, parents and relatives. He arrived here in 1823. He landed at Paihia and there built his first fortress, the church standing before you, an earlier version of this church. It was in that fortress that he forged the weapons of war wherewith to overthrow the strongholds of the earth. And then he gave a rendition of all the tribal disputes in which Williams had intervened, his long journeys across the country and so on, as well as establishing missionaries in other places. And what I find most interesting about Taupaki's language is the metaphor of fortress and war. He envisages the Paihia church as a turreted castle, or perhaps a palisaded pa, in which Williams drew on all the resources of Christian scripture and tradition and prayer to wage a spiritual war against powers present in the land. Through proclamation of Te Rongo Pai, much of it translated here at Paihia, and the missionary peacemaking, Taupaki saw that the spiritual dynamics and atmosphere of Aotearoa New Zealand underwent a profound sea change. Now, it may be a truism to say that the histories and identities of people are interwoven with the land or landscapes in which they live. So by telling the stories of people, you are telling the stories of the land, and vice versa. What I want to suggest tonight is that three sites are integral to telling the Williams story in the north and are bound up with it. This place, the Paihia Mission Precinct, Te Ti Waitangi, and Poirua Pakaraka. So I begin at the beginning, Paihia. The Paihia Mission Precinct was perhaps the central mission site of the 1820s and 30s. The Herald was built and launched here. British resident James Busby landed here in 1833 to a large welcome and hakari by local Māori and the mission. On Sunday, 9 February 1840, the first rātapu following the Waitangi Treaty signings, the Paihia Church hosted the newly minted Governor Hobson and his retinue, together with, it must be supposed, some Māori residents of the mission. And on that Sunday, it was almost certainly Williams who led the liturgy and preached the sermon on the obligations of civil government. Now, T. Lindsay Buick records briefly the happening of this service and the sermon's subject, And frustratingly, I haven't been able to, because he didn't include footnotes or endnotes, I've not been able to trace the source of the story. But it is a wonderfully suggestive occurrence. The text of that sermon on the obligations of civil government would, if it could be found, be quite a fruitful source for comprehending the missionary support of British intervention in New Tirini. And I'm jumping very quickly now to the next site, or site of memory, as I'm calling them, Te Tii. We know a lot about this site, but perhaps less about Te Tii and the Williams connection. The Paihia mission and the Te Tii Waitangi site became interlinked quite early on in the story, in the mission story. Te Tii Waitangi, the land we now know as Te Tii Marae campground, on the south side of the Waitangi estuary, was taken into some form of trust arrangement for local hapu by Williams on behalf of the CMS in the 1830s. It was the site where largely unrecorded but possibly defining treaty discussions took place. Later in the early 1890s, Henry's sons, Edward, Henry Jr. and John, supported hapu claims in the Native Land Court in furtherance of the original trust arrangement. Now there's some complexity to the story, as there is with understanding most land transactions in these early years. But I'd like to tell you how I've reconstructed this story. At least this is my reconstruction to date. In 1830, Henry Williams acquired the Te Tii land for the CMS in a transaction with Te Kimera, Te Tau and other rangatira, whose affiliations were primarily, it seems, to Ngāti Rāhiri. Jumping 9 years, in 1839 he transferred or reconveyed this land to Ngāti Rāhiri, or at least a portion of the hapu, at least a portion of the land, or should I say, or at least the portion that the hapu was occupying and cultivating. He retransferred or reconveyed it in some way to the iwi, or to the hapu. In 1841, he claimed the whole of the area, comprising some 700 acres, for the CMS on the basis of the original 1830 transaction. So you have 1830, 1839 and 1841, which was the old land claims process. So in the old land claims documents, the land carries the name Waitara, which is possibly a name certainly that I'm not familiar with apart from this story of these documents. Now Williams did not initially inform the commissioners of any trust or reconveyance of the land to Ngāti Rāhiri. However, when Te Kimera was called, he testified to his signature on the 1830 deed and agreed with the boundaries, but added that Williams had agreed to their keeping the pa area within the claim. And when the commissioners recalled Williams, he confirmed this story, emphasising that while the hapu could continue to occupy, quote, as far as the stream Heneriria, unquote, they could not sell to a third party. Now, there might appear to be some wrinkles in the story, at least on the face of it there appears to be. For example, why, if Williams reconveyed the land in 1839, did he claim it for the CMS in 1841, seeking effectively a grant or confirmation of land ownership from the Crown? And why did he not testify at first to the existence of the ongoing occupational cultivation by the hapu of a portion of the land? These are difficult questions to answer, perhaps without further or more meticulous research. What I have not told you yet is how we know about the 1839 retransfer. And this, I think, is possibly the most interesting part of the story I'm telling tonight. In 1891, so some 50 years later, the Native Land Court sitting at Kawakawa awarded the whole of the 700-acre block to the local hapu Ngāti Rāhiri. They did so primarily, it seems, on the basis of an original document executed by Henry Williams in 1839, apparently reconveying the entire block. What is most interesting, for me anyway, and for the journey that I'm going on tonight, is who was supporting Ngāti Rātiri in the Land Court. It was Henry Williams Jr., Edward Williams and John Williams, Henry's sons. They testified to this reconveyance and or to this understanding, or to their understanding, that their father had wished to preserve this land in possession of the hapu to occupy and cultivate and for fishing. And this very significant fact helps to reconcile the earlier narrative somewhat, I think. For if Williams had intended this, which the Land Court evidence clearly supports, then it made sense for him to seek an award to the CMS in 1841. By holding the legal interest under a Crown grant, the CMS could protect the hapu interest, perhaps as a type of trust or beneficial interest. And other researchers have referred to it in this way. There were, of course, a number of CMS deeds at this time that were mostly entered into in the very late 1830s, mostly in 1839, if I recall, that were of a trust nature. Trust for Māori, that is. And if the CMS, however, if the CMS were not awarded this land, then it would be left legally unprotected, because of course the early commission process was about reconfirming purchases, acquisitions, for want of better words, by Paihia. So it wasn't about granting any land to Māori. Now what happened? What happened was that through the contortions of the old land claims process, in part due to the artificial policy about maximum areas able to be awarded to Paihia claimants, and probably a good deal of colonial politics thrown in, the CMS was eventually only granted a portion of all its Paihia Waitangi claims, and these extended basically from, I think I'm getting this right, from Te Tii through to Opua. They were only granted a portion of those claims, and I didn't have time to do the exercise of what percentage, but it was probably less than half at a rough guess. So the area that they were granted did not include the Te Tii Waitangi land. So then what happens with it? Or what happened to it? Other Land Court evidence suggests that, in fact, the Crown had sought to claim Te Tii as surplus land, which is what happened in this process. Any land that was surplus to what was granted to Paihia was, in many cases, taken by the Crown as surplus land, somewhat controversial policy. So, if this had occurred, of course, the land would have been lost to Māori, as happened in other areas. It is tempting to speculate that in this event, the Te Tii Waitangi Marae campground that we know today would not exist. This is, of course, a mere counterfactual. What we know is that Henry's sons, who are prominent people in their own right in the 1890s, well, I mean, Edward was, I don't know how old he was at the time, I haven't done the maths, but they were getting on some advanced years by the 1890s. They stood by the claims, and I'm sure that this must have counted, it's reasonably obvious that this counted a good deal in the Native Land Court of that time. Going a little bit further into this story, the Williams also paid for Ngāti Rātiri's lawyer. Henry Williams Jr.'s diary for either the 30th or the 31st of March 1891 records the following. Tāne called to say the Native Land Court will sit at Waimate on the 8th April to hear the tea case. I arranged with Reed to conduct the case for them for £5. We are to meet at Reed's office on Monday to coach Reed up in the case. And then on 2 April, I was in the office all day preparing the papers re Te Tii for Reed on Monday next. That's from Henry Williams Jr.'s diary. Now, who was this Tāne? His fuller name, Tāne Haratua, appears in the court's 1891 order at the very top of the list of names. And it's almost certain, and this is another thing that I haven't researched or been able to get to, that he was a son more probably grandson of the haratua that became one of the Williams' good friends at Pakaraka in the 1850s. So the stories of Henry Williams' role in protecting the Titi land lives on, though perhaps some of the detail I've been talking about has been lost to living memory. This is one example of this living on. At the 150th Williams family commemorations in 1973, the family was welcomed onto Te Marae, and Tā Hemi Hinari, or Colonel J.C. Hinari as he then was, reminded those gathered that Williams had given the land to the local hapu in the early days. That's at least the account in English that I've been able to find. It's possible that he was speaking English, actually. Fitting then that Williams has been carved into the central po in the whare whakairo at Te Tii. And we've just been having some accounts today from some of the local hapu, Ngāti Kawa, in fact I think is sitting down the back, who's been telling us a bit more of that story. So it's nice to fit some of these pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. I think it's significant that 50 or 60 years after the period of the original transactions, whatever the exact nature of those transactions, the support the Williams family showed for Ngāti Rāhiri demonstrates the presence of meaningful intergenerational relationships that had their taproots in the pre-treaty mission period. Beyond the simple reality of ongoing relationships, I am interested in the question of to what extent deeper and enduring culture change was experienced by European British missionaries in New Zealand. This is a subject requiring real scrutiny by historians and anthropologists. To what extent was a new type of human being created by the sustained intergenerational contact in a new land? I would like to refer to another example that suggests that sympathies between descendants of missionary and Māori ran deep, affecting the outlook on issues of the treaty and justice especially. Bit of ice. And I won't refer to the context here because this is another complex story. But I'll simply quote from this 1867 document by Henry's son, one of Henry's sons, T.C. Williams. And this is a little bit of a quote here, so bear with me. From an 1867 publication. As I hold the opinion in common with many others, I had a sense that I could get a little bit emotional trying to read some of this stuff tonight, if that's comprehensible. That the Treaty of Waitangi has been clearly broken by the government of this country in their dealings with the natives, the acquisition of the Manawatu block. And as I am the son of the Reverend Henry Williams above named, I need offer no apology for now coming forward to assist the natives on the north side of Cook Strait and standing up for their rights guaranteed to them by the said treaty. I bring no charge against the colonists for whom, as a body, I, in common with Parakaya and many of his countrymen, have a great respect. I believe them to have been misinformed and misled. When I ask any intelligent Māori the question, who are to blame for the past and the present state of things in New Zealand, the reply is a ready one. Ko ngā kaimahi o te kāwanatanga. When I myself am asked a similar question, my reply is the same. The government and the officers of the government. And more than that little excerpt, what is fascinating is the way that TC signs off this document. A native of New Zealand. Thomas C. Williams, a native of New Zealand. Taita, Wellington, July 18, 1867. I'll return in a moment to this subject of culture change The third site at Paihia or Pakaraka was and still is known as the Retreat. In many respects, it inherits the history of the first two sites as Henry and Marianne, together with some of their Paihia Māori friends, moved there in 1850. A key site in its own right, the area holds an important place in the origin stories of today's Ngāpuhi iwi, and being one of the most archaeologically explored sites in Aotearoa. It is interesting that the original Williams land borders an ancient wāhi tapu and comprises Paihia Maunga. And within the land's boundaries, that is the boundaries of the original transaction, were reserved two other wāhi tapu and an occupation reserve. Williams later purchased the occupation reserve in 1860 for reasons that are unclear, perhaps because the land had not been occupied or used by Māori for some time, but it is the case that that particular transaction has received some recent criticism from some local Māori in the tribunal process. However, many of the same people that were involved in that transaction, I believe it was, but I didn't have time, I should say, to fact check this before tonight, was Te Tau and Te Kimara were also involved in that transaction as they were involved in the Te Ti transaction. So the physical journey that the Williams took to Pakaraka on this retreat took them past Te Ti Waitangi. And it was a journey that symbolically ties the three sites together. I want to read a few excerpts from this retreat account from Marianne Williams' journal. And I realise some of this will be familiar to many of you. But I think it's really critical to learn from document sources like this. Once again, the relationships that had been established between a Māori and missionary in those early years. There's so much colour as well as pathos in these sources. So I just want to read one or two excerpts. In a letter to England, Marianne said this, and this is the week of before they left to Paihia. So there's a lot going on that week because it was a very sudden departure. The tribe from the Kawakawa came down with their chief Tamati Pukatutu, the chief who protected the English stores and the camp at the Kawakawa landing place at the last expedition of the English during the war. They expressed their great anger that Te Wiramu should attempt to leave Paihia without their consent, and at first declared that he should not go anywhere but to Kawakawa, whither I was to be taken, forthwith in a canoe where they would build us a house. After the principal men had made their speeches with much gestures and animation, it was concluded that if Te Wiramu had been going out to sea, they would have held him back. But as he was going behind to be amongst the people, they would let him go. Having first sent to examine the road and found that it would be a shorter distance from their settlement to Pakaraka over land than to Paihia by the river. So obviously some utilitarian calculation going on there. There's a lot of complexity in this story, including what Marianne alludes to here, the fact that it seems that many of the local hapu understood Williams to have purchased the land, whereas in fact he was purchasing it on behalf of the CMS, and that is a subtlety that was obviously not apparent in those early years. Anyway, getting back to the retreat. The day of the retreat, May 31, we had some natives to breakfast, among them Pene Taui, who repulsed the troops at Ohaiwai, Tamati Pukatutu, who protected the ammunition and stores of the English at his pa at the Kawakawa landing place on their last expedition to Ruapekapeka, Wycliffe, a nephew of Kawati, but a fast friend of the English during the war. Hori, nephew to our old chief, I think there's a reference to Te Kōki, who lived with us as a boy and rowed in the boat which brought me to Paihia when I arrived. Now principal teacher at Kawakawa, and Major Hara, and then the account goes on. I'm tempted to speculate that that's Te Hara or Heta Te Hara, but I'm not sure. After breakfast, the deputation from Kororareka was introduced. Mr. Busby was also there, and James King, who had just arrived. Mr. Busby stood forth, saying that a paper had been put into his hands to read. His voice faltered, and he frequently stopped. Mr. ... Carlton doesn't say who it was, cried like a child and went out of the room several times. That was obviously to preserve some sort of decorum. My husband rose to reply. It was long before he could speak. There was a long, deep pause. We all sat and looked at each other or on the ground. The deputation requested that the address should remain with them for the addition of further signatures. The horses had now all arrived. We took leave of our kindly Kororareka friends as we were led out to be mounted. Kate moved off first and was nearly pulled off her horse on the road by poor Ritihia, who clung hold of the skirt of her dress as she was seized upon to be carried off to be married, after having hid all day to make her escape to Pakaraka. A crowd of natives shaking hands all the way, we rode down the road, a crowd at the boathouse, again at Cook's, another party on the hill. Edward, our firstborn, rode by the side of his mother. John attended his father, and Thomas, TC, rode by Kate. Penny Toey's horsemen followed, and Penny brought up the rear. About 15 of Kate's school children ran by our side and followed us to the tee, where the crew of the children and some others gave us 3 hearty cheers. It was now fine. The air and exercise greatly refreshed us. We rode cheerfully along. My husband's spirits rose as we proceeded, and as we ascended the road winding up the Taratara hill, looking down upon the graceful fern trees and the steep wooded, precipitous sides. Riding through the brushwood that shaded the road on either side, we felt like pilgrims ascending the Delectable Mountains, which is a reference to John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. We arrived at Pakaraka as the light faded before 6 o'clock and were greeted by Henry, Jane and Lydia. Our own chairs were placed for us on either side of the fire. We had reached the land of Beulah, where we may wait a summons across the River Jordan, and yet not wait idle in our Master's work, the work for which we had left our own dear native land. Kate and Lydia ran to the piano and played a duet to welcome us. And it goes on. The letter that Henry wrote to his Māori congregations a few days after that arrived in Pakaraka also fascinates me. Written in Māori, of course. The language is lyrical, with a distinct native sensibility, to the extent that I'm a judge of that. For ease, I quote the English version here, and this is a nice short letter. Poeroa, June 5, 1850. Friend, here I am residing at Pakaraka. Paihia is left, the place where I have lived ever since my first landing on this island. Paihia was not my place, and I now retire from the rage of the sea and the foam of the waves, lest I should be overwhelmed. I am now residing in the country. There are no waves here. The sea is smooth, but a gentle breeze causing a slight ripple upon the surface of the water. The top of Poeroa is to be my residence, where I can see before and behind me. No one will come here but my children. I love my children. Come, my child, and see me. I am getting old, but my heart is still alive to speak of the things of God and of heaven. Write to me. Keep near to God. his word alone is true. The word of man is false. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all things else shall be added unto you. This is from me, from your father, Henry Williams. Now, the phrase which fascinates me most about this letter is the one which says, "The top of Paihia is to be my residence, where I can see before and behind me." Now, the original te reo of this is, "Ko te tihi o Paihia he kāinga mōku, kia marama ai te titiro ki mua ki muri." Now, Williams was, of course, not going to live on the summit of Paihia. So why did he speak in this way? I think there's too much to unfold here, but perhaps Williams is revealing a comprehension of the significance in the Māori landscape of a pā sanctuary on top of a maunga, and even of the ancestral significance of maunga and of Paihia itself. Another thing is that the use of Paihia as a place referent at the head of the letter is unusual, even singular, because standardly Henry and Mary Ann would use Pakaraka. So this says to me that Williams is accentuating, well, at least it accentuates the sense that he was placing himself in this Māori landscape with some real appreciation of its significance to his Māori audience. And of course the next sentence also strongly indicates his view of the world. "No one will come here but my children. I love my children. Come, my child, and see me. Ka hore he tangata e ahu mai ki tēnei wāhi, o āku tamariki anaki. Haere mai rā e taku tamaiti kia kite iau." Jumping a little bit forward, a year or so. On April 23rd, 1851, Henry recorded it in his diary, "Trinity Church, Pakaraka, was open for service. The whole countryside, Pakeha and Māori in attendance, great rejoicings." And Mary Ann talks a lot about this in her journal, with a lot more colour than in Henry's journal, as is usual. I'll read another excerpt here. Within 12 months of the retreat, the number he baptised was 163, some of whom have been long preparing. Our congregation is a scattered one. Some come from a distance of 8 miles, but near to us are large heathen tribes who have never attended the means of grace. Sometimes I think Henry was purposefully sent to deliver his message to them. There is a shaking amongst the dry bones. Another interesting scriptural reference. The old warrior Kawati has great influence among them, and they were with him during the war. And then she goes on to describe how Kawati attended a service at Kawakawa to meet Henry and declared that he had found that the greatness of the white people was their goodness, and that all their goodness came from the Bible, and that he should now whakapono believe. And there's many other people referred to, including at the end of this passage, Heke's body was brought with great state last summer to Pakaraka, and his tomb is in these woods in a native reserve. Now, also Haratua, the original Haratua, who I believe to be the ancestor of the Tāne Haratua in the Native Land Court records 50 years later, or 40 years later, is also mentioned here as coming forward for baptism. Now, I'd just like to draw to a close in a moment, and introducing a slightly different quote. I think there's a lot in these journal entries, and it must be said that to rely on them unduly without an even-handed use of other sources would be unsafe. However, like all sources, they have their biases. But I go along with the historical vision of Carlyle and Ruskin, as recently described by British historian Simon Sharma. I really like this quote, so I'm going to read this. Quotes are great. Their passion was engaged in the redefinition of clarity, to replace the reliability of distance with the unreliable but more faithful experience of proximity. The clarity of distance proceeded from the superiority of hindsight, but Carlyle in particular yearned to make the reader humble in the face of ultimately inscrutable providence, and thus recover through rude force the uncertain outcomes of history and art, to set the reader down again on the edge of undetermined possibility. Of course, what he's really talking about here is that history is always lived forwards, but we write it looking back. And so the task of the historian is to somehow disengage from the backward-looking gaze, even though to disentangle oneself from that backward-looking gaze is almost impossible, because we are looking back. But to cast oneself into the world of the source and to attempt to see and feel through their lenses, rather, of course, than to judge them from a distance through our own. And the word that's used here is humility. I had some other historiographical references that I won't go into in some detail, but Tony Ballantyne, a Otago University historian who's doing some very interesting historical research and writing in recent years, he talks about the challenge for New Zealand historians to reframe and refocus their task as one concerned with the making and remaking of places. So rather than working with binary categories that we've kind of become really familiar with, Māori and Paihia, coloniser and colonised, and with monolithic categories like race and nation, Ballantyne argues that we need to concern ourselves more closely with the local, with the contingent, and with the peculiar, and really understand who it is that we have under the spotlight. Whether they be missionary, whaler, governor, Protestant, Catholic, or perhaps Anglican, CMS, Wesleyan, Marist, or even particular iwi. So we need much better and closer historical work that understands those local contexts. And I hope, and what I'll share with you tonight, that I've somewhat started along that historiographical journey, historiographical path. So I give the final word to Reverend Taupaki, who I began with tonight. And in a sense, what he says here is a nice way to capture the central legacies of the Williams story. This is what he said. His word was the Treaty of Waitangi. William's word was the Treaty of Waitangi, which confirmed to the natives the possession of their lands, giving to the Queen the sovereignty in the government. The phraseology of that is fascinating. Let the erection of this stone be a witness amongst us that the Māori Church shall stand and not be cast down forever. So as we think about the memorial outside this church, this site of memory, reminds us that history is more than the flux and flow of material causes and effects. It points to changes that are more profound, that go to matters of the heart, the soul, and the spirit, and thence, from those regions, back again to the world of light. Thank you very much.